Good. So Tara set the stage, which is very good. Basically, what I'm going to talk about is the pre-work that came right up until the actual design and construction of the wetlands, and Matt will talk more about that. So anyhow, that's me. So it's interesting to sort of look at sort of wetlands, treatment wetlands as part of green infrastructure. It's part of the family of green infrastructure, right? And so the urban runoff issue, the flooding, erosion control, air quality, microclimate, improving human health, it's all part of green infrastructure. They provide us a lot of services, you know, and the interesting thing is for these services, we're not paying anything a lot of times except when we invest a whole bunch. But, you know, we're getting services back for the community from investing in green infrastructure. So this is the US EPA, you know, definition of green infrastructure: processes that use natural systems or engineering systems that mimic natural processes. Mimic. In other words, we're trying to redesign Mother Nature here. And I can tell you sometimes it's really hard to do that. And we destroyed a bunch of wetlands that did this stuff for us, you know, for hundreds and hundreds of years, and now we're reinventing the wheel, basically. I call it a new old green infrastructure, basically. So typical types of green infrastructure like green roofs, permeable pavement, urban vegetation, rain gardens, rain barrels, and of course treatment wetlands. We're doing all of this stuff as part of the Save the Rain campaign right now in Syracuse. This is kind of why we're getting the recognition. So other cities are doing this too. Chicago, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Seattle, Portland, New York City, Cincinnati are all trying to implement green infrastructure to cut down on their urban runoff, as well as some cases dealing with combined sewer overflows. So a lot of the stuff is going on right now across the country. So how can we look at, well, green infrastructure, a lot of people are excited by this right now, but does it really work? Is it really efficient for what we're trying to do here? So there's different ways of looking at it. In some cases, there's obstacles to implementation. In another talk, I talked about the work we're doing on the near west side. We actually interviewed one house to house, door to door, and asked people, what do you think about green infrastructure? Do you want it in your front yard? What are your neighbors going to think about it? So we've been doing this kind of work to figure out, are there any obstacles to implementing green infrastructure? Another one is cost effectiveness. There's been a national study out of Chicago basically saying, well, you should just sell it on cost effectiveness. It costs less to do green infrastructure. Don't bother with all this ecosystem service stuff because people don't understand it anyhow, which is true. People usually don't understand ecosystem services. If you ask it, is that something government provides? Do I have to pay for it? Right? So easier just to say cost effectiveness, right? And we can look at energy analysis. Tara just talked about, you know, energy efficiency. Well, if you look at embedded energy, is permeable pavement, when you figure the total energy costs, as good as regular pavement? It's kind of almost level, actually. So we need to look at that kind of stuff, right? Life cycle analysis, we've got some students that have recently been looking at life cycle analysis of some of the green infrastructure. Interesting findings in terms of this. How does it all work out? But they do provide a lot of good stuff for us. So what's the history? In this case, Sam Sage is right here. Sam originally came up with the idea for treatment wetlands. You know, really have to give him credit, and he took me aside one day and said, we need to work on this thing, you know, and we need to work with the city and the county and try to work this thing through. And sure enough, with John Ferrante, who worked for Atlantic States Legal Foundation for a while, we started looking at the early siting for on the near west side in Syracuse. And also Steve Geruso, who actually operates the treatment wetland in Manoa. Steve was part of this in the early stages as well. And then there was a Central New York Watersheds project. We got this large, through our ex-congressman, we got this large grant with Russ Briggs at the college, and Guihan Wu was my PhD student. And from 2005, 2009, we worked on sort of the background for the Harvard Brook area, as well as Sam Sage too. And then we bring us up to the current design build, which Matt will talk about. So it's kind of like 3 stages. So the early project, we had Atlantic States Legal Foundation, the college, Onondaga County, City of Syracuse, and it was basically to try to figure out where can we do this treatment wetland. And believe me, it's not easy to find a site when you have a heavy urbanized area. You need a certain amount of land to be able to do this, and you need to be near a combined sewer overflow, otherwise you're not doing anything, right? You're not providing the service. So we had to look all over the place, looked at sites and dug up people's backyards up and down the Onondaga Creek. And we're told to get out of certain areas. we're just trying to find a site. So we've looked at 11 sites for access, land availability, engineering feasibility, hydrology, soils, the drainage area, and upstream CSO loading. We needed to be near something in order to treat it, see? So we looked at all this stuff, and Harbor Brook looked like the best site along that whole area. So some of the land was available, the topography was good, it was sort of compatible to the project, and here's looking at this whole area. The first site we looked at was right in between the Delaware and Grand, right here, near the, just right near the Syracuse Development project or center. And this is a pretty tight site. And later on, we actually migrated to this site here along Harbor Brook, where the current site is right here. So notice that all the gray area and the red area, that's all paved surface, basically, right? So you've got stuff that's running off very quickly off paved surfaces. And it's only when you get worse upstream, you see a little bit more green in terms of the land cover, right? So that's the problem. Get a huge amount of runoff, short amount of time, certain size storms. Now the other thing that was mentioned by Matt is that here's our harbor, I think this is Harbor Brook area right through here. This used to be a huge amount of wetland, right? So this light blue, here's Onondaga Creek right here. Here's on the east side. This used to all be wetland. And we've lost 80 to 90% of it. This is by one of our people here at the college actually pulled this stuff all together from old maps. I think you were involved with it too, Sam, when we did this, right? This mapping. Myrna Hall did it.
And then we had a student also whose name I have to say I forgot.
Yeah. So this is, I think this is kind of interesting. When you pull this all together, the light blue used to be all wetland area serving these natural functions. And here's a more close-up look at the watershed. And here's Myrna Hall also did this map with a student. Shows the different. So you can see the purpley, the red stuff is this heavily urbanization, and the yellow and the ochre is more upstream, less developed. And as Tara said, there's been a lot of treatment wetlands studies and installation all across the United States. There's been a whole history of this. But there have been very few treatment wetlands designed for combined soil flow. This is a new application in terms of this particular treatment technology. So we know a lot about the gravel beds, and Tara mentioned this too, that buried beds where you have gravel and there's air spaces next to the gravel, that the bacteria and algae really do the bulk of the work. A lot of people think it's the plants, right, that do the work. It's not. It's the algae and bacteria that do the bulk of the work in breaking everything down. So if you have a buried bed, you can have plants on top of it, and the oxygen goes down through, so you get aerobic and anaerobic processes working at the same time, which breaks everything down. That's the advantage. So here's our site right now, and that the wetland actually is being built upon on Harbor Brook. And here's the sewer shed. So we're basically looking at roughly about this area right here, which is the sewer shed for CSO 018, right through this area here. Okay, the second part of the study, we got some money from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency through a member item. And this funded Guihan Wu, was a PhD student that worked with me and Sam Sage. And he basically did the flow calculations, how much water, how much flow, and then what we call the pollutograph. What's the loading of the pollutants in this particular CSO? So when we did it in cooperation with Onondaga County Lab, did a lot of the testing work on this, almost all the testing work for the laboratory analysis. Now you might think, well, what's the big deal? We'll just go out and get a bunch of water samples. But what kind of samples do we need? We need it during a storm. So we got to send people out there during a rainstorm, open a manhole cover, get inside this thing, put the sample bottles down and pull the sample bottles out, messing up and polluting the sample basically, or contaminating it, right? This is really hard work during storms, getting these kind of measurements. Let me tell you, lucky we didn't lose somebody. Okay, so what do we look? We're testing for biological oxygen demand, total suspended solids, key chemicals, nitrogen, nitrates, nitrites, and fecal coliforms. This is the stuff. This is the menu. kind of stuff we have to be able to treat, right, with the treatment method. So here's what the stream looks like right now. It's not really very enticing. This probably used to be a meandering stream at one point in time. Now it's just a straight channel running down through there with phragmites growing up on either side of it. Not very enticing, don't you think? And here's the actual site here, and this is where they're building the treatment wetland right now. And I'll show you some slides of that right through here. Okay, and then you have stuff floating around the water that you don't want there, including solids and all the stuff I just talked about, right? And the other thing is the flow. We get a storm event, right? You get 50, 40, 50 of these during a year. You get a huge amount of flow, short amount of time, right? So your curve kind of looks like that. And the problem is that's the slug of pollutants. That's your pollution load that goes right in or by the treatment and goes directly into the receiving water body. That's the stuff you got to deal with. So we thought, first of all, we went to the neighborhood and we said, just maybe an open water wetland. And Rich was at the Skunk City, right, TNT meeting. We had it, right? And what was the reaction? Do you remember?
Clean it up.
Clean it up. But they did have some local, they were kind of interested in it because this could be used as a nature study area, right? Maybe. But the other side of it was, what happens? Does it smell? Other disease vectors, you know, mosquitoes and stuff like that. And will my kid drown in 2 inches worth of water? Well, there are legitimate concerns that the neighborhood has, so we had to work through that. And the county said, well, we don't want any standing water there. Good, back to the drawing board. So, just a reminder, we want stuff to be able to settle out, right? We want to settle out the solids, right? We want absorption, basically, in the sediment, the vegetation, and we want what we call biotransformation. This is the, again, this is the algae and the bacteria. They're transforming this stuff into stuff that's not harmful, right? So you've got these three processes that are going on simultaneously in a treatment wetland. So you can have surface flow, you can have the subsurface wetland that Tara talked about. So we sat down with our students and our staff and folks and said, okay, we're going to design this thing that's got an inflow system, it's got a series of subsurface wetlands, and going to have to be 2 football fields big in the subsurface. We're going to have year-round aerobic and anaerobic processes. We're going to have this outflow collection system. So we sat down and we drew this thing up, and here's the actual design drawings for the whole thing. Here's our 2 football fields worth of stuff. And notice there's this thing up here. This is an inflow structure. So the problem is we had to be able to route the water over time and over area, because you got a huge amount of flow in a short amount of time. So how do you slow it down, spread it out? Oh, and temporally. So we thought, well, we've got this thing solved. We got this thing we got here, and there's all the details, all the thing. The only problem is it cost $1.5 million to build this thing because the darn inflow structure was so expensive. So back to the drawing boards again. So this is kind of what we would like to have. So here's where we are right now, is we want lower levels of solids and nitrates and coliform bacteria, which is our biggie, right? That's the thing, it's the real threshold that we have to get to. And now we're working with CH2 on Hill to try to design this multiple 3-cell treatment wetland that we can control the inflows and outflows and run it through all 3 cells or run it parallel and see how it actually works. Because we need to have this data so that we know how effective this treatment wetland is. So that's the research part. So that's the story. It took us a while to get there, but we do have some products. If you are interested, Russ Briggs and myself have this 250-page document, if you ever want to see that. One of my PhD students did a really short thing called Urban and Rural Treatment Wetlands Manual, New Old Green Infrastructure. That's produced by the Environmental Finance Center here. It's only about 24 pages, includes 2 PhD dissertations boiled down to 24 pages. And Wu, Smartin, and Sage wrote an article in 2012 using alkalinity as a tracer to estimate the ratio of sewage and CSOs, and that's just been recently published in the engineering journals. So we've got some products. Even before we start the actual project here, and hand it off.
Good job. I'm glad you mentioned Sam's involvement. I appreciate you reminding me and all of us that Sam was key to getting this, because if you didn't, he would have called me afterwards and said, you forgot to say it was my idea again. And there isn't a lot of credit due to Sam and ASLF for putting this forward. And I'd also suggest, as Matt gets into his presentation here, on the last note of the investment, the $1.5 million for the initial design that you had, this ties back to why we're doing what we're doing with Save the Rain and why we have the resources to even endeavor on this now. Had we built the regional treatment facilities that were originally planned for the CSO program in Onondaga County, we would not be doing this wetland project. We would have built a regional treatment facility, sewage treatment plant. I think at the original location you looked at, right off of Grand Boulevard, we would have had a regional treatment facility there. We would have spent around $100 million on it, and that would have been it. And we would not be on the path that we're on now to see this great project that Matt's going to talk about. So I think that that's an important takeaway from this program, is finding that balance between gray and green allows what you're going to hear about now to move forward. So.